In a remote village surrounded by gloomy forests, there lived a mysterious old grandmother named Mrs. Smith. She was known locally for her strange customs and mysterious behavior. People said that she had unusual abilities and knew many terrible secrets. One day, strange events began to happen in the village. Animals disappeared without a trace, and at night strange sounds came from the houses. Locals said it was the work of Mrs. Smith. They are sure that she is a sorceress capable of bringing misfortune and illness to everyone who dared to anger her. Grandma Smith lived in an old, abandoned house on the edge of the woods. Her house was surrounded by an atmosphere of mysticism and fear. Black cats and owls often hid around the house, as if they were her faithful helpers. One day, a young guy named John decided to check how true the rumors about Mrs. Smith were. He began to notice that she often disappears into the woods, especially when the full moon is hanging in the sky. He decided to follow her and find out what she was doing there. John was inquisitive and brave, but the investigation of the secrets of Mrs. Smith caused him anxiety. But a terrible curiosity overcame his fear, and he decided that it was time to solve the mystery of the mysterious old woman. On the night when the full moon lit up the sky with its silver light, John hid in the thicket next to Mrs. Smith's house. He was sure that he would be able to observe her from afar and learn her secrets without catching her eye. But his expectations were wrong. After a while, he saw the old grandmother coming out of her house and heading towards the deep forest. He couldn't resist and decided to follow her at a safe distance. Mrs. Smith walked with a confident step, as if she knew the exact direction she was going. John continued to follow Mrs. Smith, keeping a safe distance so as not to be noticed. On the way to the deep forest, they passed by a gorge where bodies were lying on the ground. John's heart stopped with horror. These were not animals, but people. He could barely contain his fear and disgust so as not to make a sound. The bodies seemed dead, devoid of soul and life. Mrs. Smith seemed to pass them by without a single drop of regret or surprise. His fear only intensified when he thought that he could become one of these lifeless bodies if his grandmother noticed his trail. Finally, Mrs. Smith reached the deep forest, which seemed even more gloomy and mysterious in the moonlight. She walked on until she reached a small clearing where an old hut stood. John was surprised to see that this was not her house, but something completely different. He noticed that Mrs. Smith had taken out a candle and a small stone with incomprehensible symbols from under her cloak. She lit a candle and began to pronounce strange words that seemed to be ancient spells. Suddenly, something amazing happened. A light came on over the woodpile, as if from something supernatural. Several shadows appeared out of the darkness and disappeared into the forest. These were not just shadows, but the ghosts of people who had once left this world. John realized that he was in a dangerous situation, and decided to hide behind a tree to hide from Mrs. Smith. He was sure she didn't know he was following her and tried to keep quiet so as not to attract her attention. But his horror only intensified when he saw that Mrs. Smith was turning in his direction. He noticed that her eyes sparkled with an ominous light, as if she sensed his presence. John's heart was pounding wildly, and he felt that the blood was freezing in his veins. Mrs. Smith was approaching, and John realized that he needed to do something to get away from her. He prayed that his legs would not fail him at this moment, and tried to carefully step back and disappear into the forest thicket. But his fear and paranoia caused John was able to get to the forest thicket, where the thickets were thicker, and realized that he should just run now without looking back. The screams of owls and the crunching of branches echoed through the air as he raced forward, feeling that fear and adrenaline were making him move faster than ever. John ran as if the devil was chasing him. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like he had been running for ages. Mrs. Smith was still chasing him, and he could hear her sinister laughter, which seemed to come from all sides. John's heart was pounding so hard that he could feel it pounding in his chest. Every breath was labored, and the lungs seemed to burn with tension and fatigue. He raced forward, smoothing out his tracks, trying to find a safe haven where he could hide from Mrs. Smith. Finally, he discovered an ancient cave hidden in the depths of the forest. He decided that this might be his only chance to escape from the terrible old woman. He entered the cave, trying not to make a sound, and hid in the darkness while he tried to calm his beating hearts from fear. There was silence in the cave, which seemed reassuring after the turmoil in the forest. John realized that Mrs. Smith would not be able to find him here, and this gave him some relief. He decided to wait here until morning, hoping that the old grandmother would leave and stop following him. He sat in the dark listening to his heavy breathing and heartbeat. Time passed slowly, and every minute seemed like an eternity. John began to doubt whether he had done the right thing, and there were thoughts that he should not have gone into the secrets of Mrs. Smith. But then he noticed something strange. Strange symbols were visible on the cave wall, as if burned into stone. They were the same symbols he had seen on Mrs. Smith when she cast her mysterious spells. He couldn't understand what they meant, but it only increased his fear. John sat in a dark cave, surrounded by strange symbols, and felt that time was passing slowly. His hands were shaking, and his heart was still beating so fast that it seemed like it might jump out of his chest. Blood was oozing from small cuts on his hands that he had received while fleeing from Mrs. Smith. He realized that he had a little time left before morning, and decided to wait for dawn before leaving the cave. During his waiting, he gradually calmed down and began to reflect on what had happened. He asked himself questions. Who is really Mrs. Smith? What do the mysterious symbols mean? And what terrible power has she mastered? He understood that none of the villagers knew the real truth about the old grandmother, and her secrets remained unsolved. Gradually, exhausted